Let's start with a question. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the word miracle? Is it a dramatic, unexplainable moment? A story from the Bible? Or maybe it's just something as simple as finding your lost keys when you needed them most? Here's the thing about miracles. They have this almost magical ability to captivate everyone, regardless of belief or background. They make us pause, wonder, and ask, is there something bigger at work here? Now, when it comes to Jesus, his miracles weren't just mind-blowing events. They were much more than supernatural stunts. They were signs. They revealed his identity, his mission, and, most importantly, God's heart for humanity. But let's keep it real. If we're being honest, it's easy to wonder, did these miracles really happen? Were they symbolic, metaphorical, or literal? And if they did happen, why did Jesus choose to do them in the first place? I mean, he could have just sat everyone down and said, "Hey, I'm God, trust me." Why multiply bread and fish? Why heal blind eyes? Why walk on water? The thing about Jesus' miracles is that they're so much more than random acts of kindness or displays of power. Each one carried a message, a lesson about who he was and what he was bringing into the world. Think of them like snapshots of the kingdom of God, a place where there's abundance instead of scarcity, healing instead of brokenness, and life instead of death. Now let's talk about storytelling for a moment. Why do we remember stories like Jesus turning water into wine or calming a storm? It's because they're vivid, unforgettable, and relatable. These weren't just miracles. They were moments where real people encountered the divine. Imagine being there when Jesus fed 5,000 people with a boy's lunch. You'd probably think, wow, this guy is incredible. But then, as you walked away, the deeper realization might hit. This isn't just about bread. This is about how God provides for us. That's the power of miracles. They work on multiple levels. And don't we all have moments in life when we wish for something miraculous? Maybe it's healing for a loved one, a breakthrough in a difficult situation, or simply a sign that everything's going to be okay. These stories resonate because they remind us that miracles aren't just about what happens. They're about what they mean. Now here's something we often overlook. Jesus' miracles weren't about showing off. He didn't walk on water to get applause or turn water into wine to win Best Wedding Guest of the Year. These acts were deeply intentional. They revealed truths about God, truths about his power, his love, and his desire to bring wholeness to a broken world. Think about it. Jesus didn't just heal a blind man's eyes. He restored his ability to participate in society. He didn't just calm a raging storm. He reassured terrified disciples that their faith was enough to carry them through any chaos. His miracles weren't just about fixing problems. They were about changing lives. Over the next few minutes, we're going to revisit some of Jesus' most iconic miracles. Moments where he fed multitudes, healed the sick, controlled the forces of nature, and even brought people back to life. Each miracle is like a puzzle piece, fitting together to form a bigger picture of who Jesus is and what he came to do. Even if you've heard these stories 100 times before, stick around. You might see them in a new light, or maybe you'll hear something that resonates with your own life in ways you didn't expect. So, whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or somewhere in between, there's something in these stories for you. Let's start uncovering the miracles of Jesus and what they reveal about God's power and love. Let's talk about one of Jesus' most famous miracles, the feeding of the 5,000. Imagine the scene. A huge crowd has been following Jesus all day. They're miles away from any town and everyone is starving. People are probably thinking, man, I wish I'd packed a snack. The disciples are stressed because all they've got is one kid's lunch, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Barely enough to feed a family, let alone a stadium-sized crowd. And then Jesus does something that flips the script. He takes that small meal, blesses it, and starts breaking it into pieces. Before anyone knows it, there's food everywhere. People are eating as much as they want, and when it's over, there are 12 baskets of leftovers. Leftovers, from 5 loaves and 2 fish. This miracle isn't just about food. It's a living illustration of how God's provision works. When we offer Him the little we have, He can multiply it beyond what we could ever imagine. It's about faith, trust, and realizing that in God's hands, scarcity becomes abundance. But here's the kicker. This wasn't just about filling stomachs. Think about what this moment must have felt like for the crowd. They didn't just see a teacher or a prophet. They saw someone who cared about their most basic needs. Jesus wasn't just teaching them about spiritual truths. He was showing them what God's love looks like in real life. Now let's pivot to a miracle that feels, well, a little more festive. Turning water into wine. Picture this. You're at a wedding. The music's great, people are dancing, and everyone's having a good time. Then disaster strikes. They run out of wine. Cue panic mode. Running out of wine at a wedding back then wasn't just embarrassing, it was a major social faux pas. It could ruin the couple's reputation in the community. Mary, Jesus' mom, nudges him and says, "Do something." At first, Jesus hesitates, but then he tells the servants to fill some jars with water. And here's where it gets wild. When they pour the water out, it's not just wine. It's the best wine anyone's ever tasted. Let's pause for a second. This miracle is often overshadowed by the bigger, flashier ones, but it's profound in its own way. It's the first miracle Jesus performs, and it's done in such a low-key setting. Why? Because it shows that God cares about our joys and celebrations, not just our struggles. Wine often represents joy and celebration in the Bible. By turning water into wine, Jesus wasn't just saving a wedding reception. He was making a statement. God's kingdom is a place of joy, abundance, and transformation. Let's be real. Taxes are no one's favorite topic, but even Jesus had to deal with them. One day, Peter comes to him in a bind. Someone's asking about their temple tax, and they don't have the money. Jesus, calm as ever, tells Peter to go fishing. Fishing? For tax money? Sounds like a bad idea. But Peter obeys, and the first fish he catches has a coin in its mouth, exactly enough to pay their tax. This miracle is quirky, no doubt, but it's also deeply reassuring. It shows that God can provide in ways we'd never expect. Whether it's through a fish, a random blessing, or an open door we didn't see coming, God's provision always finds a way. Think about it. Jesus could have just handed Peter the coin. Instead, he involved Peter in the process, reminding him that obedience and trust often precede provision. It's a lesson in faith disguised as a miracle. Speaking of fishing, let's talk about another miracle. One morning, after a long, frustrating night of catching absolutely nothing, some of Jesus' disciples are ready to call it quits. But Jesus tells them to throw their nets on the other side of the boat. At this point, they're probably rolling their eyes. I mean, they're professional fishermen, and this guy's a carpenter. But they obey, and their nets become so full of fish they can barely haul them in. This miracle isn't just about a good day at work. It's about abundance, trust, and the idea that when we follow Jesus' direction, blessings can overflow. Here's a twist. Right after feeding the 5,000, Jesus starts talking about a different kind of hunger. He says, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry." Wait a minute. What does bread have to do with spirituality? A lot, actually. Jesus is pointing to something deeper. Just like we need food to sustain our bodies, we need Him to sustain our souls. His miracles of provision weren't just about physical needs. They were always pointing to a bigger truth. What these miracles teach us. When you look at these stories, there's a common thread. God's provision isn't just about meeting physical needs. It's about showing His love and care for us on a deeply personal level. Think about it. The crowd didn't just get fed. They experienced generosity. The wedding guests didn't just get wine. They saw God's ability to bring joy out of what seemed like an ordinary moment. Peter didn't just get his tax paid. He learned that trusting Jesus often leads to unexpected solutions. And isn't that something we can relate to today? How often do we find ourselves worrying about having enough? Enough money, enough time, enough strength? These miracles remind us that with God, enough becomes more than enough. Even more importantly, these stories invite us to think about how we can be a part of God's provision for others. Just like the boy who shared his lunch or the disciples who obeyed Jesus' strange instructions, we can offer what we have, our time, resources, or skills, and watch God do incredible things with it. When you think about Jesus' miracles, chances are that healing is the first thing that comes to mind. It's one of the most visible ways his power and compassion came together. From restoring sight to the blind, to healing lepers and even raising the dead. These moments were personal, unforgettable, and deeply symbolic. Let's start with one of the most touching stories, the healing of the blind man. One day, Jesus encounters a man who has been blind from birth. The disciples ask, "Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Back then, people often connected suffering with sin, like bad things only happen to bad people. But Jesus flips the narrative. He says, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him." Then, in a move that's equal parts miraculous and, well, messy, Jesus spits on the ground, makes mud with the saliva, and puts it on the man's eyes. Can we just pause for a moment to imagine what the man was thinking? He couldn't even see what was coming. Jesus tells him to wash in the pool of Siloam, and when he does, his sight is restored. Now, this miracle is more than a physical healing. It's a wake-up call. The blind man sees, but the Pharisees, religious leaders who were spiritually blind, don't get it. They're so stuck in their rules and skepticism that they miss the bigger picture. Leprosy in Jesus' time was a devastating condition. It wasn't just a health crisis, it was a social death sentence. Lepers were outcasts, forced to live on the fringes of society and shout "unclean" whenever someone came near. One day, 10 lepers approached Jesus from a distance. They cry out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." Without hesitation, Jesus tells them to go show themselves to the priests, a necessary step for being declared clean. As they go, they're healed, just like that. But here's the twist. Only one of them comes back to thank Jesus. And it's not just anyone. It's a Samaritan, someone the Jewish people would have considered an outsider. Jesus asks, "Were not all 10 cleansed? Where are the other 9? This story isn't just about physical healing. It's about gratitude, faith, and the inclusivity of God's kingdom. Healing isn't just for insiders. It's for everyone. Here's another unforgettable moment. Jesus is teaching in a crowded house, and it's so packed that no one else can get in. 4 friends show up, carrying a man who's paralyzed, and they're determined to get him to Jesus. When they can't get through the door, they go full-on Mission Impossible, climbing onto the roof and lowering their friend down on a mat. Jesus sees their faith, not just the man's, and says, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now this throws the religious leaders into a fit because only God can forgive sins. So, to prove his authority, Jesus tells the man, "Get up, take your mat, and walk." And he does. This miracle is so layered. It's about physical healing, yes, but also about forgiveness, faith, and breaking down barriers, literally and figuratively. Those friends didn't let anything stop them from getting their friend to Jesus, and their faith became a part of the miracle. Now let's talk about a miracle that's equal parts heartbreaking and breathtaking. A synagogue leader named Jairus comes to Jesus, begging him to heal his dying daughter. On the way to Jairus' house, Jesus is delayed by a woman who touches his cloak to be healed. More on her in a second. By the time they arrive, it's too late. The little girl has died, but Jesus doesn't flinch. He takes the girl's hand and says, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." She does, and the grief in the room is instantly replaced by awe and joy. This moment shows us something profound. Jesus' power isn't limited by time or circumstance. Even when it seems too late, he can bring life out of death. Let's circle back to that woman who interrupted Jesus on his way to Jairus' house. She had been suffering from a bleeding condition for 12 years. She'd spent everything she had on doctors, but nothing worked. In her culture, she was considered unclean, which meant she couldn't even touch others without making them unclean too. But she hears about Jesus and thinks, if I just touch his cloak, I'll be healed. So she pushes through the crowd, touches his garment, and instantly feels her body heal. What's amazing is that Jesus notices. He turns around and says, "Who touched me?" The disciples are like, Jesus, everyone is touching you." But Jesus isn't asking because he's angry. He wants her to know she's seen, valued, and loved. He says, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering." This miracle isn't just about physical healing. It's about restoring her dignity and identity. Jesus doesn't just fix what's broken. He makes people whole. What these miracles teach us. When you look at Jesus' healing miracles, you see a pattern. They're personal, intentional, and transformative. Jesus didn't heal people in bulk or treat them like problems to be solved. He saw their pain, their faith, and their humanity. These miracles also challenge us to think about what healing means. It's not always about fixing a physical condition. It's about restoring relationships, breaking down barriers, and bringing people back into community. And here's the thing. These stories remind us that healing isn't just something Jesus did back then. It's something he still offers today. Maybe it doesn't always look like a miraculous recovery, but it could be the strength to keep going, the peace to face a challenge, or the support of a community when we need it most. Nature is powerful. From towering mountains to raging storms, it has a way of reminding us how small we are. But in Jesus' miracles over nature, we see something incredible. A power that transcends the natural world. A power that isn't bound by the laws of physics or logic. Let's start with one of the most iconic moments in the Gospels. Picture this. Jesus and his disciples are in a boat, crossing the Sea of Galilee. It's been a long day, and Jesus is so exhausted that he falls asleep in the stern. Suddenly, a furious storm rolls in. Waves are crashing over the boat, and the disciples, several of whom are experienced fishermen, are terrified. In a panic, they wake Jesus and shout, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" Now pause for a second. How many of us have been in a storm and thought, "God, do you even care what I'm going through?" Jesus gets up, rebukes the wind, and says to the waves, "Quiet, be still." Instantly, the storm stops, and everything is calm. The disciples are in awe. They ask each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him." This isn't just about Jesus showing off his power. It's about showing his authority over chaos. Whether it's the literal storms on the sea or the figurative storms in our lives, Jesus reminds us that he's in control, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. Now let's talk about another water-related miracle. Jesus walking on water. The disciples are in a boat, again, but this time, Jesus isn't with them. It's late at night, and they're battling strong winds and rough waves. Suddenly, they see someone walking toward them on the water. Naturally, they're freaked out and think it's a ghost. But then Jesus speaks. "Take courage. It is I. Don't be afraid." Peter, in classic Peter fashion, decides to test the waters, literally. He says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." Jesus says, "Come." Peter steps out of the boat and starts walking on water toward Jesus. For a moment, it's incredible. But then Peter notices the wind, starts to doubt, and begins to sink. He cries out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reaches out, catches him, and says, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" This miracle isn't just about walking on water. It's about walking in faith. Peter sank because he took his eyes off Jesus and focused on the storm instead. How often do we do the same? When life gets tough, it's easy to let fear drown out our faith. But this story reminds us that even when we falter, Jesus is always there to catch us. This next miracle is a bit different. One morning, as Jesus and his disciples are walking, he sees a fig tree in the distance. He's hungry, but when he gets closer, he realizes the tree has no fruit, just leaves. Jesus says to the tree, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And by the next morning, the tree is completely withered. On the surface, this might seem harsh. After all, it's just a tree, right? But this miracle is a visual parable. The fig tree looked healthy from a distance, but up close, it wasn't bearing any fruit. It's a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving. In our spiritual lives, it's not enough to look the part. We're called to bear fruit, to live lives that reflect our faith in action. We touched on this miracle earlier, but let's dive deeper. After a fruitless night of fishing, Jesus tells the disciples to throw their nets on the other side of the boat. The result? Their nets are so full of fish they can barely haul them in. This miracle is about more than fish. It's about trust and obedience. The disciples could have ignored Jesus, thinking, "What does a carpenter know about fishing?" But instead, they listened, and their obedience led to abundance. It's a lesson for all of us. Sometimes God's instructions might not make sense, but when we trust and obey, the results can be life-changing. Yes, we've already mentioned this miracle, but it's worth revisiting in this context. Turning water into wine wasn't just about saving a wedding. It was about showing Jesus' mastery over the natural world. Think about it. Jesus didn't just create wine out of thin air. He transformed something ordinary, water, into something extraordinary. It's a beautiful metaphor for what he does in our lives. He takes our ordinary, our mundane, and transforms it into something full of joy and purpose. What these miracles teach us. When you look at these miracles over nature, one thing stands out. They're not just displays of power, they're deeply symbolic. They reveal truths about God's character, his kingdom, and his relationship with us. Authority. Jesus calming the storm reminds us that he has authority over chaos. Faith. Walking on water challenges us to keep our eyes on him, even when life gets tough. Obedience. The miraculous catch of fish shows us the blessings that come from trusting his guidance. Transformation. Turning water into wine reminds us that Jesus can take the ordinary and make it extraordinary. And here's the thing. These stories aren't just ancient events. They're invitations. They invite us to trust in a God who's bigger than the storms, who walks with us on the waves, and who turns our scarcity into abundance. If there's one category of miracles that stops everyone in their tracks, it's resurrection. Bringing someone back to life? That's a game changer. In these moments, Jesus didn't just restore life. He showed his ultimate power over death itself. Let's start with one of the most dramatic and personal resurrection stories, raising Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus wasn't just a random person. He was one of Jesus' close friends. When Lazarus became seriously ill, his sisters, Mary and Martha, sent word to Jesus, hoping he would come immediately. But instead of rushing to their side, Jesus waited 2 days before setting out. By the time he arrived, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. Now, 4 days is significant. In Jewish tradition, it was believed that a person's soul lingered near the body for 3 days after death. By the 4th day, there was no hope of revival. Death was final. So, when Jesus arrives, the situation seems utterly hopeless. Can you imagine being Mary or Martha in that moment? They must have been devastated and maybe even a little angry. Martha even says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." But what's striking is her faith, she adds. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus responds with one of his most profound declarations. I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. Then he goes to the tomb, prays to the Father, and shouts, Lazarus, come out! And Lazarus does, wrapped in grave clothes, but very much alive. This miracle isn't just about Lazarus walking out of a tomb. It's a declaration of Jesus' authority over death and a foreshadowing of his own resurrection. Another resurrection miracle happens in a small town called Nain. Jesus and his disciples are approaching the town gate when they see a funeral procession. The dead man is the only son of a widow, which means her future is now incredibly uncertain. In that culture, a widow without a son had little to no social or economic security. Moved by compassion, Jesus goes up to the coffin, touches it, and says, Young man, I say to you, get up. The man sits up and begins to speak, and the crowd is filled with awe. What's remarkable here is that Jesus isn't asked to perform this miracle. He acts purely out of compassion. It's a reminder that God's power is always coupled with his love. This wasn't just about restoring one life. It was about restoring the widow's hope, dignity, and future. We touched on this miracle earlier, but it's worth revisiting in the context of resurrection. Jairus, a synagogue leader, begs Jesus to heal his daughter, but by the time they arrive, she has already died. The mourners are weeping, and it seems like all hope is lost. But Jesus says something extraordinary. The child is not dead, but asleep. People laugh at him. But he takes the girl by the hand and says, Talitha koum, little girl, I say to you, get up. She does, and her parents are overwhelmed with joy. This story reminds us that Jesus sees beyond the finality of death. What looks like the end to us is just the beginning to him. It's also a powerful reminder that faith doesn't mean we won't face tragedy, but it does mean we can trust in God's power to bring restoration, even in the darkest moments. Of course, the most significant resurrection is Jesus' own. After his crucifixion, his followers were heartbroken, defeated, and afraid. The man they believed to be the Messiah had been executed in the most brutal way possible. But 3 days later, everything changed. The tomb was empty. Angels proclaimed that he had risen, and Jesus began appearing to his disciples, proving that he was alive. He ate with them, talked with them, and showed them the scars in his hands and side. His resurrection isn't just a miracle. It's the cornerstone of Christian faith. It's the ultimate victory over sin and death, and the reason Christians have hope for eternal life. As Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 15, if Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. What makes this miracle so profound is its global impact. It's not just a story. It's a turning point in history. Jesus' resurrection transformed his followers from a fearful group of disciples into bold witnesses who spread his message to the ends of the earth. What these miracles teach us. Resurrection miracles are about more than just bringing people back to life. They're about hope, restoration, and the promise that death doesn't have the final word. Think about the people in these stories. A grieving family, a heartbroken widow, a synagogue leader on the brink of despair. In each case, Jesus steps in and transforms their pain into joy, their loss into life. And isn't that what we long for? To know that even in our darkest moments, there's hope. That when it feels like all is lost, God is still at work, bringing life out of death. These miracles also remind us that resurrection isn't just about physical life, it's about spiritual renewal. Just as Jesus called Lazarus out of the tomb, he calls us to step out of whatever is holding us back and embrace the abundant life he offers. So whether it's a literal resurrection or a moment of personal restoration, these stories invite us to trust in a God who is always in the business of bringing dead things back to life. Let's be honest. Sometimes it's easy to see Jesus' miracles as ancient stories, distant from our lives today. But the truth is, These miracles carry timeless lessons. They challenge us to grow in faith, deepen our trust in God, and recognize His love at work in every moment. Think about the feeding of the 5,000. That wasn't just about bread and fish. It was about trusting that what we offer, no matter how small, is enough in God's hands. Or consider the healing miracles. They weren't only about curing illnesses. They were about restoring dignity and belonging to people who felt forgotten and rejected. Each miracle was intentional. When Jesus walked on water, He showed us what faith looks like in action, trusting Him even when everything around us feels uncertain. And when He raised the dead, He reminded us that even in the darkest moments, hope is never lost. But here's the thing. Miracles aren't just events in the past. They're living lessons for us today. God is still working in miraculous ways, though they might look different. Sometimes it's the big miracles, a dramatic healing, an impossible prayer answered. Other times, it's quieter, a deep sense of peace in a chaotic season, unexpected provision when you need it most, or even the strength to endure what feels unbearable. Jesus' miracles also challenge us to live differently. They remind us to be people of faith, love, and trust. Faith to believe that God can do the impossible. Love to show compassion, just as Jesus did when He reached out to the outcast and brokenhearted. And trust to know that even when we don't understand, God is working for our good. Where do you see God's hand in your life? Maybe it's in a small kindness you received or a prayer you thought went unanswered but later realized was exactly what you needed. These moments might not make headlines, but they're no less miraculous. Jesus' miracles aren't just something to admire. They're invitations to trust God's love and live with bold, unshakable faith. When we look at the miracles of Jesus, one theme shines through: God's power and love working together in perfect harmony. These weren't random acts to impress a crowd. They were deliberate signs pointing to who Jesus is and what He came to do. Think about it. When Jesus turned water into wine, He wasn't just saving a party. He was showing that God's kingdom is one of joy and abundance. When He healed the sick, it wasn't just about physical restoration. It was a glimpse of God's ultimate plan to make all things new. And when He calmed storms or raised the dead, He reminded us that nothing is beyond His control. These miracles also highlight God's compassion. Jesus didn't perform them to show off His power. He did them to meet real needs, whether it was feeding a hungry crowd, restoring dignity to a leper, or bringing hope to a grieving family. Through every miracle, He showed us that God's heart beats for His people, then and now. But miracles aren't just stories to admire. They're calls to action. They ask us to live with the same compassion, faith, and trust that Jesus modeled. Maybe it's offering kindness to someone in need, trusting God in a challenging season, or stepping out in faith to do something you never thought possible. And here's the beauty. The same God who worked miracles through Jesus is still at work today. Maybe you've seen it firsthand, a healing you can't explain, a relationship restored, or a moment of peace that carried you through a storm. Or maybe you're waiting for a miracle, hoping for God to move in a situation that feels impossible. Wherever you are, these stories remind us that God is always at work, often in ways we can't see. His power hasn't changed, and neither has His love. As we wrap up, take a moment to reflect on what resonated with you. Was it a story of faith? A reminder of hope? Or maybe a challenge to trust God in a new way? Whatever it is, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs encouragement, and let's keep the conversation going. What's your favorite miracle of Jesus? Drop it in the comments or tell someone about it. Together, we can celebrate the God who still works wonders and invites us into His miraculous story.